Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our November 18th Boca Valley Research Center seminar. We're pleased to have Kevin Kriese joining us today. A little bit of housekeeping. We have started a YouTube channel with our seminar series videos. If you visit vvcenter.ca and look on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see where we promote our seminars, and you'll be able to find the YouTube link there. We are recording this seminar, and let's see. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting from the traditional territory of the I'm hosting from the traditional territory of the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And I'll take a moment to introduce Kevin here, and then I'll turn it over to him. Kevin Kriese was appointed chair of the Forest Practices Board in August 2018. Prior to that, he spent most of his career working as a public servant in the fields of land use, organizational leadership, and reconciliation. Kevin has been a resident of Smithers since 1995, and we're really pleased that he's able to join us today and present some of the recent findings and recommendations from the Forest Practices Board. We have a fair number of reports that they put out, and it's great to have his perspective and insight in helping us navigate that. Welcome, Kevin, and thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Dawn, and thanks to the Center for hosting and to everybody for joining. I am coming from Smithers, Wet'suwet'en territory, and today, powder heaven. Secret to any cross-country skiers, if you go to the tracks today, you will find fresh set trails. You never heard it from me. I'm going to cover some of our recent reports from the Forest Practices Board. I got lots of pictures. There's about 50 slides. I'll move pretty fast, and great time for a bit of a summary conversation at the end. But if people have questions along the way, maybe you can flag and then Dawn can interrupt me. That might be the best way to go. So first, I will selfishly try and get, if people are not already connected to the board, we have a Facebook feed, we have a Twitter feed, and we have a website, obviously, with a newsletter that gets your annual reports and notices when our reports come out. And I am selfishly here trying to get people to read our reports. Hopefully this will interest you in some of our work. And our reports, in the 25 years that the board's been around, we have over 680 some odd reports. We'll do anywhere from 15 to 20 reports in a year, and some of them are big, and many of them will interest you if you care about forest practices. For those who aren't aware, I think most of you, I saw the names, you're pretty aware of the history of the board, but the board was created, it is 25 years ago, as one of the pillars of the change in response to the war in the woods. There's a bunch of others that went on, but we are now 25 years old, and the idea was to create an independent watchdog to ensure that forest practice changes through the Forest Practice Code were being implemented, and to ensure that compliance and enforcement was adequate. Our fundamental purpose is objective and independent assessment of compliance with the Forest and Range Practices Act and the Wildfire Act, and we have a specific mandate to periodically audit the appropriateness of government enforcement. And a big part of this is we are a public reporting organization. We provide our reports to the minister, but I do not report to the minister. We're an independent organization, and our reports go to the public. Talk a little bit about how we do it. We have several things in legislation that we must do. We must undertake audits of licensee performance under FERPA. We must also respond to complaints made by the public with respect to implementation of the Forest and Range Practices Act or the Wildfire Act. And we may undertake special investigations. Those are investigations into bigger picture issues than pure compliance or local issues that you might see through a complaint or an audit. I will say much of what I'm going to talk about is our special investigations, because that's often where people get the biggest, I'll call it kind of bang for the buck in terms of understanding what's going on. But our core programs remain ensuring that licensees are audited and that we respond to public complaints. I want to talk about our team a little bit. I'm the spokesperson for the board, and I'm going to explain to you some of the reports that we've done, but this is absolutely a team effort. We have an amazing staff. They're professionals in a whole range of disciplines, and we also sometimes bring in some amazing consultants to assist us in our reports. So those people are critical to the work that you're going to see me presenting. And we also have a board. The board right now consists of 5 appointed members that are part-time, and these are people who have gained, the height of their careers. These are highly respected individuals in the field of either forest or other forms of natural resource management, and they essentially form that public oversight function for the Forest Practice Board along with the chair. One thing that I want to emphasize, and this is the board has a particular focus on FERPA. That's in our legislation. And we must, as I mentioned, undertake particular activities related to FERPA. A lot of what people are concerned about and come to us are actually about what I'll call forest management, issues that are beyond forest practices. So I cut a clip off of a famous book from the 1970s called Forests for Whom and for What. And the issues about who should benefit from the forests, things like tenure and community control, and should we have more competitiveness, bigger industry, smaller industry? Those kinds of things are not in our bailiwick. Those are issues in the forest management system, and those are lots of really interesting, legitimate debates in British Columbia, but we are about forest practices. A couple other things that we do not have jurisdiction over items under the Forest Act, so things like timber supply review, setting of the AAC, utilization standards. We're also not land use planning. Land use planning is the process where government says, is it appropriate to log? We are about the practices. Are you using the right techniques to achieve your objectives? So that's a little bit of a frame, but it's something that people often forget because these things are very interrelated. But we focus on the practice side of things. So in our must-do side, I talked a little bit about our audits. We average about 12 audits per year, including 2 for BCTS, BC Timber Sales. And for about 10 years, the findings have been trending up. We actually, if people are interested, we had very high levels of audit compliance in the code era, and that went down with the introduction of FERPA, and for the last few years, it has been trending up. We also have what we call our complaints program consists of about 850 concerns a year, and a concern is when someone calls us. A complaint is when we issue a report, so it's a bit of a distinction. And we had 83 last year. Our actual complaints tend to focus on issues like water quality, old growth, biodiversity, and species at risk. So that's a little bit about our complaint side. I won't spend a lot more time on that after this. Our special projects, which is really where I'm going to spend most of my time, we do about 2 to 3 special projects a year. They examine systemic issues. We also undertake appeals where we can join or launch appeals to the Forest Appeals Commission where the public interest is not otherwise represented. This is pretty dry legal stuff, but occasionally we do find things that are going on that just don't make sense in the appeal function. It's usually kind of arcane legislative structures. We do spend a lot of time working on that, and nobody else plays in that space, so it's something we really value. An example which was really interesting last year for me is we joined an appeal where the argument was over whether or not a guardrail is part of what makes a bridge structurally safe and sound for industrial use. Now that's pretty minor, but in this case, the licensee had not properly maintained the guardrails. We argued that was a legal requirement to be structurally sound and safe, and the Forest Appeals Commission was convinced by that argument by ourselves as well as by the ministry, and the finding against the licensee was upheld. I'm going to just quickly touch on one report way back in time on community watersheds, not because this is not such an issue in the Northwest, but a really big issue in terms of our overall complaints. And you see lots of conversations in BC about water security. And we did a report on community watershed management, made some recommendations around that. I think it was 2014. And part of the reason I wanted to show this is this upper left picture with all the trails and so on is actually the watershed where I saw Dave Wilford on this. I think Dave gets his water from that, as do I. This is Canyon Creek. And in this case, what we found in the community watersheds was that FERPA practices were reasonable for the most part, and were being well implemented in most of the community watersheds. It's a bit more nuanced story than that. But about a third of the issues we found in community watersheds were legacy, pre-FERPA issues, and about a third were non-forestry. So in this case, this is actually mineral exploration in Upper Canyon Creek, and that was the most significant detrimental factor they found in the Canyon Creek watershed. I just want to flag that one. If you're interested in community watersheds, take a look at that particular report. I'm going to jump to the more modern era, and I want to highlight there's a lot of conversations in BC about legislative change. There has been a first round of changes introduced to the Forest and Range Practices Act in 2019. That's the first changes in over a decade, almost 15 years since FERPA was introduced. And part of that reason, so there's lots of conversations, and in 2017, the board produced a special report called Opportunities to Improve the Forest and Range Practices Act. And that was based on the board's findings in various reports of where we saw gaps in the legislative regime. And so we made a series of recommendations to government. First, strengthening district manager authority. The premise being that a public official should make ultimate decisions over public lands and public uses of the land. And there are many places where the district manager simply doesn't have what we believe was a necessary authority to sometimes say no. Strengthening public engagement. I think this is well understood by most people here that the structure in FERPA essentially has a planning regime where you can't see where roads and cut blocks will be located. And the board found that that's just not appropriate, that for people to meaningfully engage in public involvement, comment on forest stewardship, most stakeholders who care about recreation or range or other sort of values need to be able to see where the logging is actually proposed. Strengthening objectives and practice requirements for drinking water. In particular, we identified a gap in the current regime where there is no requirement to manage source water protection. And that's, I'm going to come back to sediment later, but there's a gap. Source water protection is not part of the FERPA regime. And finally, transparency of penalty determinations. Again, this is a bit arcane, but you cannot go on a public site and find out if there was a contravention under FERPA, what the outcome was and what the penalty was. And we believe that should be in the public domain. The ministry agrees, but their perspective is they need legislative change to implement that, and we hope that happens. Finally, access management. I won't say too much more about that. I think most people here are aware we have a significant plethora of roads on the landscape, and BC needs a series of tools and objectives around managing access. I'm going to come back to how to do that. I want to jump ahead to one of the first reports we put out when I was chair, and that was our second area focusing on changes to FERPA. After that 2017 report, we stood back and said, what else do we believe are the required changes? And we identified basically a fundamental gap in the planning regime under FERPA. And many of you are aware there's gaps in the way forest stewardship plans work. They're hard to measure. And in my view, they are actually not plans, they're contracts. And the board for a long time has observed gaps in the planning regime as trickling down to poor practices. So we prepared a report called Tactical Forest Planning, the Missing Link. And many people refer to this as landscape level planning. A lot of reasons why we chose the term tactical planning, but you get the picture. If you understand landscape level planning, that's basically what we're calling for. I want to just show this picture because it sort of cements why. In BC, we have a long history and in fact, a demand for more strategic processes, land use planning being one, but also things like species at risk planning, things like good policy development, cumulative effects, and so on. But that tended to go straight to operations with no translation layer in the middle. And when FERPA was designed, FERPA requires clear objectives. And tactical planning is used through most modern forest management jurisdictions have a layer of tactical planning to translate your strategic objectives into what's really feasible and to predict that out into the future to see what kind of future forest you will achieve, what kind of benefits it creates. And then from there, you do your operational planning, which is, I wish to harvest a cut block in this area with this kind of technique, this kind of tools, these kinds of reforestation objectives. That middle layer, where you design your future forest scenarios through tactical planning, is missing in BC, and that's essentially what we were calling for. We prepared a series of principles for tactical planning. The first being that it should be inclusive, and this is where we specifically reference the emerging importance of doing this in partnership with Indigenous communities. We talked about a principle that it be integrative. There's lots of separate planning processes: access planning, species at risk planning, timber planning, silviculture planning, you go on and on and on. And in our complex world, that kind of plethora of plans that don't speak to each other is probably not going to serve us well. So what we called for is a planning process that, to the degree it can, integrates those multiple issues and values into a single layer. Place-based and forward-looking is pretty obvious, but it needs to be grounded in a particular location. We called for the forest management unit because that's the area which most of our objectives can be reconciled at. And forward-looking, that comes back to this issue. You really have to be figuring out what kind of forest you're going to achieve 50, 100, or 150 years from now. So often plans that people call tactical plans have a 5 or 10 year focus, and that's simply not enough. Embedded in the forest management system, what we're really saying is this has to be part of FERPA, and it has to drive decisions that follow under FERPA, whether that's a reforestation process or a prescription, your access management planning, and therefore your design of your roads, the taking out of roads, and all those kinds of pieces. So it has to be embedded in your forest management system, and finally informed by a continuous improvement process. So tactical planning remains, and many of you will be aware the ministry has proposed bringing in what is now called forest landscape planning as a fundamental change to FERPA. If there's one thing that the board is most excited about in terms of the proposed FERPA changes, this is it. This should be the place where we have more of these conversations that are missing in BC about the values we want from our local area and how we're going to get them there. I will say we have concerns about the pace. This is going to be really, really complicated. There's a lot of good people in the ministry trying to figure it out. They're trying to undertake pilots, but this is going to be a big deal. So I would encourage you to pay attention to tactical planning or forest landscape planning. I want to talk a little bit about one of our reports that came out this spring. In particular, our reports often get a lot of press time when they highlight something that's really bad, and often we also find some things that are really good. The upper left picture is a picture from a 2014 report on bridges where we found significant safety concerns as well as significant environmental concerns with how bridges were being constructed in BC. We want bridges to look like the one on the bottom right, properly constructed, safe and sound, and strong, good environmental values. The good news is that after that 2014 report, industry and the ministry took it very seriously, initiated a series of actions, mostly around training for professionals who were designing and delivering bridges on the ground. And we revisited that report. We took another sample and produced a report the spring of this year, which essentially found that practices had fundamentally improved between the 2014 report and the report we released this spring. So there's a quote: we're pretty pleased to find better results than last time. Professional associations and government deserve recognition for their efforts. And really this was about making sure professionals understood the standards and were actually implementing those standards on the ground. So that was a really positive story where our reports, I think, really caught people's attention and galvanized action. So you can be confident when you drive across a forest bridge that's recently constructed that they're being constructed and managed well. I'm going to talk a little bit about a process that, or a report we released in May of this year about conserving fish habitat. It's the second of two reports where we looked at practices actually on the ground. And what we did is we looked at 5 case study watersheds, one of which not too far from home, the Owen watershed just south of Houston. And we essentially did looked at 5 different characteristics of fish passage, and I'll just talk to you about the summaries, but we used commonly understood and commonly used protocols for assessing fish habitat characteristics in the field. And I think our investigators spent about 5 days in each watershed, you know, driving around, doing the evaluations, and then it took us about a year to write up the report. But here's one, I said earlier, we tell it like it is. When we look at FERPA practices, industry is building good bridges and mostly not building many culverts where there are fish streams, fish values, fish habitat. So we are basically getting a low level of risk to fish habitat from current crossings. Now, this doesn't deal with legacy crossings, of which there are many. This is about FERPA practices, but it's a good news story. Range use, again, a good news story. For the most part, we found pretty good range practices, except in one watershed you'll see on the right. Our staff with significant intrusion of cattle into the riparian area, largely caused by, it looks like there was some historic clearing or something 30 or 40 years ago that eliminated the barriers near the riparian, and cows essentially trampling the riparian values. And the wood jam watershed is a very valuable salmon habitat. So also, though, good news story is once the ministry and licensee were informed of this, they immediately went out and installed some fences to try and fix this. So we saw some immediate sort of results about that, but pretty good practices with some particular areas for improvement. Riparian buffers. Basically, again, we found in 4 out of the 5 watersheds a low level of risk to fish habitat from riparian buffers. And this is largely because, frankly, the Forest Practices Code and FERPA embedded some pretty good management practices for most of our fish habitat. The one exception, which we note in the report, is the management of small streams, S5s and 6s. There are concerns around that. And in some cases, that is leading to, like in the Owen, a moderate level of risk to fish habitat. And there is some particular areas for improvement required around the management of small streams. Channel condition. This one's more complicated. We found a bit more of a mixed bag. And channel condition is a whole mixture of what's going on in that channel in terms of stream aggradation and deposition and a whole bunch of structural attributes of the actual channel. And it can be a mix of both natural, historic, and current management practices. So we found 3 watersheds at moderate risk and 2 watersheds at low risk. And a couple of these, it was actually things like the impact of fires, or in the case of like the Memeke, significant legacy impacts from harvesting prior to the Forest Practices Code, in that case back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And those legacies live on with impacted channel condition. Now, that was 4 values where we actually found not bad practices with room for improvement, but we didn't find anything sort of systemic. However, in this case, I'm going to start to show you some much more interesting pictures where we're seeing sediment from roads that does cause damage to fish habitat. So this is a good picture, a lot of sediment being deposited on a bridge surface, and right there is a fish stream, and that sediment will end up in that stream. Both of these pictures show situations where there's a lack of revegetation, effectively allowing sediment to move through, in this case, on the right, through a culvert. There's a fish stream nearby. There's no culvert blocks, there's poor vegetation, and on the left side, a very steep slope, which will continue to rill, probably wasn't constructed in a way that can minimize sediment delivery or sediment rilling. So poor construction practices, poor maintenance practices leading to sediment impacts. This picture is actually on the Owen main line. Those of you who've driven down towards Huckleberry Mine know it's a really big main line, lots and lots of traffic. And in this case, it's just really poor maintenance practices where the grader has basically created a stream, a long rill alongside the edge that runs down, carries sediment, and then breaks through, and right behind where it breaks through is Owen Creek. So you basically have created poor maintenance practices, basically creating sedimentation into Owen. So what we found was 3 out of 5 watersheds had high risk to fish habitat from sediment. 1, the Memeke on the coast, had low risk, largely because of the construction practices on the coast are quite a bit better, using ballasted road surfaces, a whole series of other parts right from construction. So pretty good story for the Memeke on the coast, and the wood jam sat kind of in the middle. Our perspective is, and this is actually a picture of a bridge that's well built, but if you see the sediment down in the front, someone just went and dumped, it was some sort of road maintenance thing. They just dumped a bunch of dirt in snow, probably right next to a creek. And what that shows is that someone just wasn't paying attention and probably wasn't aware that they were depositing sediment. It was just a miscellaneous activity. And our perspective is that you do not have a culture of good sediment management on forest roads. The same way we believe you actually have a culture of pretty good riparian management in BC. This is a deeper analysis of why that has occurred, and in our view, this is just shows you that there's a regulatory gap. There is not a particular legal requirement to manage sediment through the life cycle of a road. And our recommendation to the ministry is that they should fill that gap and revise FERPA to make it clear that depositing sediment throughout the life cycle must be avoided or minimized. So this is back to our recommendations amend FERPA. I'll also say something we find quite frequently is that there has been less emphasis on training around best practices in the forest practices world for the last decade. There was an enormous amount of effort to train right from the senior foresters, the operational foresters, people hanging flagging, to the operators running machines on the ground. There was an enormous amount of training in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we believe that needs to be re-implemented. The example of a grader operator who doesn't realize their grading practices are creating sediment can be fixed through training. I'm going to turn to our most recent special report called Reforestation in the Dry Interior Douglas Fir Ecosystems. And I wasn't sure I'd put it on for the BV Research Center, but in many respects, while we don't have the dry IDF here, some of the lessons I think are applicable throughout the province. So I'm going to touch on this one a little bit. Basically, we set out to look at whether the dry interior Douglas fir was seeing species conversion, because there had been a trend or a fear of significant movement from natural Douglas fir forests to after harvesting planting of pine. And pine is not is a suitable species, but not always the best species for the long term. So we looked at 4 forest districts and examined both pre and post-harvest species composition, and then looked at whether they were complying with FERPA requirements, whether they were making good choices for reforestation, and how effective was government's direction around reforestation. So this is what we expected to see. Very dry site, hot, 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 with lots of pine. But in fact, while we cannot statistically verify, the trend that we heard and saw is that there's actually been, in the last decade, a trend away from using an over-reliance on pine. So super pleased to see that orange bar in the middle is the pine, the blue on the bottom is Douglas fir, and Douglas fir is a much more appropriate species for this, particularly on the drier sites. It's going to survive better. So anecdotally and through what we revealed, there is actually a positive trend from that perspective. Also, we found that there was compliance with the Forest and Range Practices Act requirements. A few minor exceptions, but for the most part, licensees were meeting their requirements. Now, I want to be clear, we didn't test whether these were going to get to free growing. The timing of our sample was basically, had they met the regeneration delay, had they met their initial requirements to establish the stand, but we hadn't assessed whether they would actually meet free growing. That's going to take a while. However, I'll also say that they were marginally meeting many of the stocking requirements. So maybe meeting minimums, but not targets. I also think this is really where the story comes out, is that in that dry ecosystems, we found marginal stand condition in many, many cut blocks. So the amount of cut blocks that were good in terms of stand condition, 25 out of 69, and by leading species, basically the same. So we found a lot in the poor column and quite a few in the marginal column. And if a stand condition is poor or marginal, it is very questionable whether or not that will actually be a quality tree or whether it will even survive to make free growing or to make a long-term forest stand. So this is the kind of thing we saw. In this case, you'll see very little evidence of seedlings. It's a hot site, and there was, they just didn't, they failed to establish a plantation successfully. This is a really interesting one to me. Grass competition in this part of the world is huge. If you don't get trees established early, you will basically, they will suffer and probably not be able to reestablish because the grass essentially drinks up all the good moisture and chokes out the regeneration. You can see here a lodgepole pine that looks kind of marginal. There just isn't the shelter, the kind of site preparation, and other things that you need. In this case, I want to emphasize we did find some places where there were good practices. In this case, someone had actually done some site prep, which helps the seedlings find a proper home. Sometimes it helps improve moisture. They had left behind structure, which creates shade. So they'd employed a series of best management practices, and lo and behold, they had a pretty nice looking plantation. Why does this matter? These dry sites are the hottest and driest sites where we grow forests or grow timber in British Columbia, and they're going to get hotter and drier. So the current extent of the dry interior Douglas fir is shown on the left. The yellow is the extent of the interior Douglas fir, and on the right you'll see one of the predicted climate scenarios has the interior Douglas fir growing massively, including maybe coming up to our part of the world. Although we won't see the dry IDF, we may see the wetter versions of the IDF. And what you'll also see, which is interesting, the red is the ponderosa pine bunchgrass, and a lot of that red expands. So the sites we were looking at, the dry interior Douglas fir, is actually predicted to move from a forested ecosystem to essentially a savanna grassland, ponderosa pine and bunchgrass mix. So it's going to get hotter, it's going to get drier, and it's going to get a lot harder to keep trees on it. So we recommended that the province reassess the long-term reforestation objectives for the dry IDF and update them based on the likely consequences of climate change. Now, this is an area, there's lots to talk about under reforestation. There's some really interesting work being done by the ministry to introduce climate-based seed transfer and assisted migration. And they've actually really started to land that in the last year or two. But it's not clear whether or not the reforestation objectives themselves have really taken into account the depth of impact that we're likely to see on some sites from climate change. In our part of the world, that won't be a conversion from what you see in the dry IDF from a forested ecosystem to a non-forested ecosystem, but it could be a situation where some of the modeling has predicted that, for example, spruce will be very, very difficult on droughty sites, and will it even survive, or will it become basically just fall out of the ecosystem due to insects and drought stress? So we think more work needs to be done to really take a look at climate change and update your reforestation objectives. Once you're clear on what you want, the reforestation standards need to be updated. We believe that this is a place where too much flexibility is provided through a professional alliance or guidance model, and the province needs to use its legal tools. If your goal is to get 1,200 stems on a site, it's probably not okay to have all your stands or most of your stands meeting 800. You need to make sure you're meeting 1,200 if that's really what society wants from your long-term stand. And I will say there was an enormous amount of work we found by the districts we looked at, the 4 districts, mostly down the Caribou, Thompson, Okanagan, to create best management practice guidance. What should you do as a forester? But I will say it was disappointing to see that wasn't being taken up for a whole host of reasons, some of which were maybe it was a bit confusing, not consolidated, but also some foresters just clearly were not aware of it. Maybe were not sophisticated in their understanding of the forestry requirements. These are pretty tricky sites, actually. You need to be pretty sophisticated in how you undertake reforestation on these sites. And we just felt that it was disappointing they were not being fully followed. So that's the end of the highlights from our recent reports. And I wanted to summarize kind of what does it mean going forward. I would highlight kind of the things that we most are focused on in terms of changes to forest practices. As I mentioned earlier, our number one requested change would be to introduce a really robust form of tactical planning into FERPA that complements and delivers land use planning and strategic land use planning, but makes it more real on the ground. Second is we still have not seen a full implementation of the improved public involvement we called for. It appears to be coming with the changes from FERPA 1, but has not yet actually been implemented, but that's a place that we still need to see landed. Increasing district manager authority. Again, there were some changes made in that direction, but we don't think it went far enough. Reforestation in the dry IDF, and I would say, and this probably the lessons here have application elsewhere in the province. For community watersheds, improving source water protection and making sure that there is a requirement for source water protection. And then pretty clearly from our fish report, there's some immediate changes that could be undertaken to improve forest practices for fish. And that would be target sediment. You could make changes very quickly by changing the legal requirements and getting better training. I think that's all I was going to say. I will maybe just a bit of a highlight where we're going next. We have a few other reports that are likely to come out in the next little while. We have a report that will be of interest on goshawks as an example of management of species at risk under FERPA. We also have a special report coming on recreation. And beyond that, we're going to start looking at some new reports, probably driven by our priorities around climate change and Indigenous relations. So, but in the next 6 months, I expect to see 2 new special reports, one on goshawks and one on recreation. So that's the end of my presentation. And that was really fast.
Thanks so much, Kevin. That's excellent. What a